Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about climate and the science of denial with my guest, David Lipsky. He is a writer, journalist, and educator. He is author of the New York Times bestsellers Absolutely American and Although, of course, you end up becoming yourself, the basis for the acclaimed movie The End of the Tour. He has written for The New Yorker, The New York Times, Harper's, Rolling Stone, This American Life, All Things Considered, and New York. He is the recipient of the National Magazine Award and the GLAAD Media Award. His work has been collected in the Best American Short Stories and the Best American Magazine Writing. He is a professor in the creative writing program at New York University. And his most recent book is The Parrot and the Igloo, Climate and the Science of Denial. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on the program.
It's great to be here, Nancy. Thank you for inviting me.
This was one of the most superb, excellent books about climate change that I have read in years. It is a wonderful background with detailed information about climate deniers and even people like myself who have been following the science of climate change for decades. Learned so much reading your book because you go into depth about the story of inventors, the story of hucksters, zealots, dreamers, crackpots, and you really provided detailed information why we should all be doing something about climate change. First, I want you to explain to our audience why you focused on the deniers instead of telling everybody that we have a climate crisis.
Nancy, what did I have done to have made it not just one of the best in years, but the best? Like, I worked really hard. It was really meaningful to me and to the people who, when you're publishing, there's editors and marketers and agents, all wonderful people. It really mattered to us when the Times reviewed it in this nice big full-page thing, the New York Times, when they said that it was a cliffhanger, that we had taken this complicated story and not just told it, but turned it into a cliffhanger. So our aim, Nancy, was always to get you to say that it was not one of the best, but damn it, the best.
I do believe it is the best in terms of explaining what has happened that some people still deny our climate change emergency because there is no denial. You pointed out that thousands and thousands of scientists internationally agreed that there is a problem, and yet you also showed about the deniers creating fake petitions saying scientists disagreed.
Yeah, it's one of the weird things. It was a thrilling story to get to tell. It was a treat to tell the story from when we first learned this might be a problem to when we became fairly sure it would be a problem to when we then heard from people saying, no, there is no problem, just keep doing what you're doing. And I think part of the difficulty, Nancy, was that the story took place over a long period of time.
You described in detail some of the scientists back in the 80s and 90s, some that I interviewed on my program, like James Hansen and Sherwood Rowland.
You interviewed Sherwood Rowland? God, you're so lucky. What was he like?
These were scientists who pointed out that we have been doing something terrible. Rowland and his associate Molina showed that CFCs were bad. James Hansen showed that there was a change in the climate. You talked about other individuals who'd done major research like Charles David Keeling, who year after year documented the change. These were scientists that were really being ignored by the politicians who needed to do something.
Yeah, you could hear how happy I was when you said Sherwood Rowland. He said a great thing. So, look, it's a fun and upsetting story to have gotten to tell. The book, that was part of what the Times was getting at, was that it's funny. And it's funny because we've known for so long and we have continued to find ways to not do very much about it. And so I love that you mentioned Sherwood Rowland and Hansen, because what they said in 1986 and then in 2016, they stand for the whole story. What Sherwood Rowland said in 1986 when he found out that a consumer product we had, the propellant for shaving cream and for underarm deodorant, it was just those little spray cans that we remember from like the 70s and 80s. Turned out they ate the ozone, and the ozone is the SPF factor 100 that keeps all of us from getting sunburn with skin cancer. Just bad luck. He and Mark Molina found out that those molecules would eat away the ozone molecules, and they would absolutely raise the incidence of skin cancer. And Rowland couldn't get action. There was no question he was going to win the Nobel Prize, I think 8 years after he said this. But at the time, what he said is demoralized and wonderful. What's the point of advancing a science to the place where you can make accurate predictions if in the end all we're willing to do is stand around and wait for the predictions to come true? And then in 2015, when Dr. James Hansen, who really was A, America's and then B, the world's most famous single climate scientist, he was at NASA, and he was one of the first people who was not just following this, but was willing to make testable predictions, like the temperature will drop because of a volcano next year. This was a volcano in the Philippines in the early 90s, but then within the next 2 years, it will resume its march of raising about 1 degree. Hansen, in 1988, he became the first scientist. The science started being developed in America in the mid-50s. It actually goes back to the end of the previous century. But he took a deep breath, bit the bullet, choose your mouth-based metaphor, and he went before Congress in June of 1988, and he said, this is not in the future, this is happening now. And when he was asked why he did that, he said, one of those great things that you know both sounds like a sappy movie and is also true. He said in the future, he didn't want his grandchildren to say that Opa, he's married to a Northern European, so I guess Opa is what kids call their grandparents there. Opa knew what was going to happen, but didn't make it clear. And he spent 4 decades trying to make it clear. And then when he retired from NASA at the end of the last decade, 2015, 2016, he said, it's as if we don't know. He said, I failed in my task, obviously. It's as if we didn't know because it seems to have made no difference in the way we act at all. We might as well not know. And that was the answer to the question that Sherwood Rowland had asked in 1986.
The international community agreed that there was a problem in an international conference in Japan and created the Kyoto Accords, which the United States did not want to sign. They then met many years later in Paris in France and created the Paris Accords, which we did sign until we had a president who took us away from it. Then we had a president who took us back into it, and now a president who took us away from it. And so it seems as though the United States doesn't choose to be a leader in doing something about this major problem.
Yeah, there's 2 ways of looking at that. For example, the international group is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was begun in 1988, and none of the people who had an interest in the issue, specifically the oil companies and then people who turned coal into light switches, which has made life better in every precinct of this globe for 100 years, none of them fought the formation of that international group of scientists because what they knew was it would take 20 or 30 years for them to go through all the evidence and finally say, yes, people are doing this. And so one of the things that the scientists smiled about was, in a weird way, the people who keep making money by allowing us to pollute the temperature of the future, that they welcome that international group. They started in 1988, and only in 2007 were they able, because they're very scrupulous, to announce to the world, it was at a press conference in Paris, that with a high degree of confidence, there was no question that humans were changing the climate, and they were changing it deleteriously. And wonderfully, in the meantime, people who made money selling the things that contribute to temperature pollution, they were able to make hundreds of billions of dollars a year and all the years in between. So it was a victory for both sides, that scientific organization.
There were so many fascinating parts of your book, and we're going to be talking about some of those inventors and other people who were doing research that caused our technology to create this dilemma that we're in. But the deniers, and you went into detail about how they took the template of the tobacco industry, who, when it was shown that tobacco caused cancer, said, oh no, we just need more research, and they created all sorts of fake research organizations to let's study the problem more, even though the problem had been studied. And you pointed out that the climate deniers, the people who wanted to pollute and keep causing problems, did the exact same thing. campaign. They created organizations that sounded very legitimate, like the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine and many other organizations that really had scientists who were paid by these industries to come up with positions that said, oh, we need more research, it's really not a problem. I can't recall how many you mentioned and discussed, but it seems as though they were very effective for many, many years.
They were great. One of the best ones was funded by ExxonMobil and Sun Oil and Getty and et cetera. BP was one called the Global Climate Coalition. And it sounds like they're working the environmental side of the street. But then you would go there and it would be like, please tell your children that having carbon dioxide allows us to have much richer vegetation. And if they like dinosaurs, when there was more carbon dioxide, they were dinosaurs too. So this is nothing to be worried about. But you would see, oh, my kid is on the website for the GCC. That certainly sounds like a worthwhile organization. One of the best ones that came from the tobacco companies was an organization called the New York Society for International Affairs. It's such a great story, but it was such a great thing. It was sending governors of states that, weirdly enough, had pending tobacco legislation on governors' desks. They were sending governors on things like fact-finding missions across Africa that would include sort of lavish stories, and everyone began to investigate this charitable organization. And it sounds like the New York Society. It sounds like it would be a building, a marble building with pillars and sort of steep steps and serious people walking in and out. Nobody could find address for it. The Wall Street Journal, which you would think would be supportive of stuff like this, they realized they had a great story on their hands, and they kept trying to send reporters to find an address. They finally found one that it was in a residential high-rise, and they then got the president of the New York Society on the telephone. He turned out to be a senior vice president at Philip Morris. Philip Morris was giving 99% of the operating funds to the New York Society, and when they pressed him for the address, he said, oh, this isn't really an address, it's mostly just a chair in my apartment. And that allowed the Wall Street Journal to have a great subhead in their article, one that you can run maybe once a century in the publication. The subheadline was headquartered in a chair. And a lot of the places in almost any issue where it sounds like you'll have the Oregon Society or you'll have the National Society for Pediatric Doctors, if you push through the first layer, they tend to be headquartered in a chair. We are so programmed to visualize marble pillars and steep stairs that we then think, if this august group is saying it, I, as a layperson, just as a voter, should probably go along with what they're suggesting.
Chapter after chapter, you describe in depth various fake organizations who claim to be doing research on the issue of climate, really aren't. They're paid for and fronted by the corporations who want to continue to pollute. They try to sound like respected scientists doing research. How many are there?
That was one of the questions that people have been mystified by, because as it became more and more clear, as the temperatures got warmer and as more and more scientists came forward, people were wondering, why do the majority of people still not believe in these clearly demonstrated researches? A popular science magazine went to a man named Steve Malloy, who is one of the leading deniers, and they said, look, how many of you actually are there? It's amazing what you've been able to do. And he thought about it, and he kind of smiled, and he said, there's only about 25 of us. It's a real ragtag bunch. It would be the same people would be in a group called New Hope Research Establishment. New Hope was run by a student of a man named S. Fred Singer, and his group was called the Center for Science and Environmental Policy. According to the New York Times, one of the world's 3 leading deniers was a man named Lord Christopher Monckton, who had no science credentials of any kind. And when he testified before Congress, he testified as the spokesperson for a group with a name like the Center for Advanced Studies. And when you looked at the address, it was actually a postal box at a UPS store in a mini mall in central Virginia. It didn't matter. Most people would never get a chance to do the research. They would just hear the name, think it was serious, and move ahead. So 25 people at organizations that would be what the Wall Street Journal would call chair organizations. Every person kind of had their own, and it just sounded serious enough.
I hate to mention all these fake scientists. They shouldn't get publicity, but I guess we should be aware about them.
I think we should be aware about them, too, because it helps us to understand why everybody got so good at arguing as opposed to at acting that we really don't get things done, because the tobacco industry knew by the late 40s that tobacco would cause lung cancer, that there was a there was a connection, and that if they said that we need to see an absolute scientific link as opposed to what we ourselves have demonstrated, that they could stall for 50 years and continue to make money. Their template was, don't fight the research. Anybody hearing tobacco company fights research, attacks science, no one would believe that. That's too obvious. And what they came up with in the middle 50s was you hire your own scientist and then you give it a name with the word research. And they came up with the model for what you would use in fake studies about education or about immigration or about gun control, the Tobacco Industry Research Council. And they had the absolute genius of public relations, a man named John Hill, who started probably still the world's the most powerful and single most famous public relations company called Hill and Knowlton. And what he said is having the word research is crucial. And what he added is it's just reassuring to people they will not trust you without it. But with it, you could stall action on almost anything upon which you wanted action stalled.
We are going to hear more of the stories that you present in your book, The Parrot and the Igloo, Climate and the Science of Denial, when we return in a moment with my guest, David Lipsky.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with David Lipsky, a writer, journalist, and educator. Your book truly goes into detail, but it's fascinating reading. It's captivating. You started it, though, in a way that I totally was not prepared for, and that is talking about the inventors, Edison, Tesla, Westinghouse, and how electricity and other inventions truly made a difference in terms of what's going on with our climate. Could you explain why they are so important?
Two things. A, to me, it suggests that there will be at some point, and this, by the way, is whatever politicians say publicly, what they tend to believe is that we will invent our way out of it. And so I think it was interesting to discuss how we invented our way into it. But it helps us to understand and accept that this change happened. We had no control over nighttime until about 1840 and 1850. In the 1840s, we had gaslight. Before, it meant that you were misleading people close to you. What gaslight meant was that you could take a walk after 8 p.m. There used to be a great name for burglars. Highwaymen are the people who would rob you if you were in a horse-drawn carriage. Footpads were the people who would rob you in any city after about 8 p.m. because there wasn't light. Gaslight came in, and you could have night classes, and you could have people taking walks and going to restaurants. Totally changed the world. And then Thomas Edison realized he had been using electricity for what was the high-speed internet of his time, which was just the telegraph, and he realized that you could use it to illuminate homes, and then you could sell the electricity. And that changed everyone's life. There used to be a thing on the U.S. Department of Energy website that said that in the last 100 years, in the last century, the universal adoption of electricity was the fastest adoption of any technology ever and had profoundly changed human society in ways we were only beginning to grapple with. But it's a way of understanding what has happened since 1882, when his technology first went viable, when he had his Apple, let's introduce our Edison products. 82 is when he flipped the switch in New York City. We had something we never had before, which is we have these inventions that make every life better, but we also have to generate a lot of carbon dioxide to turn the turbines that bring the electricity to our homes. And so within about 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, people began noticing that there was a weird change in the temperature. One of the first scientists who was smiled at by the British Meteorological Society, he began saying, hey, temperature, there's been a theory since the 1890s that enough carbon dioxide is going to begin changing the climate. And not only is that possible, but it is happening now. That scientist is now seen as the first scientist who has said, yes, it has absolutely started. This is a man named G.S. Callender. He was a British scientist who the heat units that would measure global warming ended up being named after him for a short time, but he had to wait 30 years for that honor. At the moment when he said it to the big august people in a room that really did have steep marble stairs and pillars, people smiled fondly and said, oh, that couldn't possibly happen, even while their offices and even that hall was being lit by lights that were powered by carbon dioxide generating turbines.
We don't have time to talk about all the different people involved in this issue in your 480 pages. Are there any scientists that we haven't given proper credit to, or politicians or activists?
Yeah, I think Ben Santer, who was a climate modeler at Livermore, he took tremendous heat during the last great push by the deniers, which was at the end of the off. And then Jim Hansen, we talked about him, a hero. You hear my voice kind of missing up. One of the weird things about Jim Hansen is his background. He's like from a Frank Capra movie, and then he did his research in the same building where Seinfeld is set. So if you've ever watched Seinfeld, you know that diner Monk Stop. They shoot that, I think, at 112th Street, about 4 or 5 blocks down from Columbia, and NASA has offices in the same building. And so what a great story for this brilliant scientist, Jim Hansen, who moved from Iowa, and the town that he's from in Iowa, what it's most famous for is Donna Reed, who is the female actor lead in It's a Wonderful Life, and he moved from the Capra world of the 30s and 40s to Seinfeld, which is our world where, among the other things we have to be worried about, is the fact that we are polluting climate. And one of the things that reporters from the Times or from Time Magazine or from NPR, what they would notice is that he would never curse. He still had farm manners. Like, he had the really lovely manners that we associate with the middle of the country. And then when he retired, and a great reporter who clearly loves him from the New Yorker, Elizabeth Colbert, also a hero, by the way, when she interviewed him, asked if he had a benediction, a little smile, and you could see the ghost of a smile across his face, and he said, "I'd like to say to younger people, we're sorry we left you such an effing mess." And so this issue taught him how to curse.
Let's talk about some of the Nobel scientists, because they are major achievers in their field. In your book, you have a quote from 1929 by Albert Einstein: "The great creators of techniques, among whom you are one of the most successful, have put mankind in a perfectly new situation to which it has as yet not at all adapted."
Nancy, you're the only person in all the many wonderful conversations I've had about this book on air and in person. You're the only reader to have quoted that great line. Yeah, it was a thrilling story to tell. But towards the end of his life, he had won, and so he was being treated in a way we'll never see any celebrity treated again. The president rode with him in a train to a banquet in his honor, and at that banquet were the heads of every major international corporation. Even Einstein had a special radio hookup from Berlin where he could raise a glass to Edison along with everybody else, and he said that haunting thing. Everybody was saying something positive, and Einstein looked forward and said, "Yes, you are the great creator of techniques. You are Tony Stark, and you have put us in a situation to which we have not as yet at all adapted ourselves." That's 1929. The Great Depression amusingly started about a week or two later. Edison, now that's almost a century ago, he guessed right about the century that we've just lived through. Thank you for that, Nancy. That was such a treasure. Like, it was so cool to hear that sentence. Wow.
You're welcome. And in fact, if I had the time, I would quote so many other chapters and paragraphs that you have written in this excellent book, The Parrot and the Igloo, Climate and the Science of Denial, because you describe different people. I followed the issue for decades, but you went into depth in their background. We know about Nobel scientists like Linus Pauling. We know about Svante Arrhenius, who directed the Nobel Institute. He thought the ocean would take care of everything, would be the sink to handle it. Pauling did some great discoveries, but yet he changed his position.
He was quite mad, it turned out. The reason that Nancy and I are laughing is that a lot of the people, the book tells the story. It's a giant story, sort of like Godfather or They Will Be Blood, or like the story that Yellowstone tells in its main series and in its various prequels. It tells the story of the inventors, then the scientists who began to say, hey, there could be a problem here, and then the people who were brought in to lie about that problem. And the deniers, they're interesting. It shouldn't surprise us. They are villains who have decided to accept their status as villains, and their motivations were often fascinating. So Dr. Linus Pauling, only person still in history to have won 2 unshared Nobel Prizes. Nobody else has done it. Some people are wearing like 3 or 4 Super Bowl rings. Linus Pauling would have been the only person to wear 2 2 Nobel Prize rings where no one else was sharing half the ring with him. One was a Peace Prize and one was for chemistry. He hired a very promising young doctoral candidate who then got his degree named Arthur Robinson. Nancy, do you take vitamin C? Did you grow up taking vitamin C?
We were taught that vitamin C is very healthy for us.
That's just from Linus Pauling. Our society is powered by electricity. Electricity can come from coal or nuclear or solar. Scientists are often powered by ego, by ability and ego. And Pauling really wanted a third Nobel. He wanted to be the Chicago Bull. So he wanted to get another Nobel by developing vitamin C. He had spoken to some Swiss athletes who swore by vitamin C. And so he began popularizing it in the early 70s. Before he was popularizing it, maybe 1 in 50 Americans were taking vitamin C, 1 in 100. By the end, it was 1 in every 4 Americans were taking daily vitamin C. Vitamin manufacturers had never seen anything like it. And he hired this doctoral candidate, Arthur Robinson, to help him prove that vitamin C could cure everything. He ended up claiming it could cure not just the cold, but even herpes, AIDS, and cancer. And so Dr. Robinson was supposed to be assisting him with the studies. What Dr. Robinson found was that he felt that vitamin C did strengthen organisms, but what it was strengthening in the mice that they were testing was it was making the cancer stronger. It gave the mice more cancer. And so when he brought those research results to Linus Pauling, Pauling threatened him and said that if you publish this, I'll see that you never work in science again. When Robinson said, hey, we're scientists, we should make this broadly known, he fired him, did destroy his reputation. There was a lawsuit which Dr. Robinson won, and when it was all over, he took the $500,000 settlement he received to build the Oregon Center for Science and Medicine. It was now being run by somebody who hated the establishment and wanted to disagree with whatever the establishment said was accurate, was right. There's a simple psychological thing that you can kind of tell with many of the deniers. If the culture is telling you you aren't as good as you think you are, or in the case of Robinson, which is such an extreme story, but a great story to tell, you have tangled with someone famous and we have cast you down. One way to tell the overculture, to tell the society that it's wrong, is to disagree with its basic assumptions on things like climate change. And then also there is indeed a lot of money. And the Oregon Center was really fun to write about. It was another chair organization. When scientists would go out there expecting a thriving research community, it was just a barn in Dr. Robinson's backyard. And Dr. Robinson became so powerful by putting together a petition proving that there were some number of scientists who disagreed with climate change that he was suggested by the first Trump administration to become the science advisor to the White House during Trump's failed re-election campaign in 2020. His research on climate change, I hope you could hear the air quotes that my voice attempted to put around research, was the single most shared item on Facebook. So someone who just has a very angry, bad backstory can end up changing the course of how people respond to not just a national, but a global problem.
And this is the kind of story that you told chapter after chapter of different people, different organizations, different aspects of this problem, and it's captivating. I encourage everybody to get a copy through the regular bookstores and online sources to get The Parrot and the Igloo, Climate and the Science of Denial. Wonderful research, wonderful description about what has gone on, what is going on. I want to thank you so very much for making this available to the public. We needed this information desperately. Do we have to be worried about our carbon footprint?
We should be worried about the phrase because it shows just how wonderfully silky the engineers of opinion are, and how effective they are. British Petroleum in about 2006 did not want to be regulated. They didn't want a tax put on their product. They didn't want people driving less. They wanted the onus shifted from them to you, to your kids, to your parents, to your friends, and they paid a giant advertising firm to come up with an idea. The idea they came up with was your carbon footprint. You yourself, you, Nancy, your neighbors, you should be computing how much you drive, how much you throw away, and while you're tallying that stuff up and feeling guilty, British Petroleum and Exxon and Shell, they could keep selling the product. So many of the things that we do that we think are conscious-driven, many of the things that make us feel conscious-stricken, they amusingly, awfully, enragingly are actually designed by people who are continuing to furnish the problem.
Thank you so very much for being my guest.
Oh, Nancy, it was great. Thanks for a wonderful conversation.
I have have been speaking with David Lipsky, who is a writer, journalist, and educator. He's authored many different books. He is a professor in creative writing at New York University, has won many awards, and is author of The Parrot and the Igloo, Climate and the Science of Denial. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.